Hello and welcome to the Darkside. I am just going to go and check the pages to make sure that you all have permission to comment and I can see your comments. That's the main thing. Looks like my camera is still loading, but it's okay. Edit, where is it? I haven't done this in a while. Oh, do we have to even do all of this now? I don't know, maybe it all works now without anything. If we can't see your comments, please help me with this. Right, so let me see. Okay, I don't know what to do. Maybe it all works. Right, welcome to the dark side. I'm just going to put it like that because I don't know if you can hear, see, do anything. So if you hear me, see me, and are watching, please do comment in the comment section so that we can have a great conversation this Sunday. So welcome to the dark side. Hey, Mr. Storm, how you doing?
I'm good.
He's good. Right, we've had a bit of a hiatus, and this is season 3, episode 1, which is really exciting. It's good to be back. You will be glad to know that Mr. Storm has bothered me for about 2 or 3 months to get started again. And so I finally managed to get it together. And here we are. Doing my little dance, ready for the evening. Righty then. So I guess with that, we give you the welcome introduction and say why and how we've had such a long break. We were always ready to have a break in between our seasons, but this break has been longer than normal, and the reason for that is because I got quite sick. And if you want to know more about that, you can check out my YouTube page, Pastor Purple, over on YouTube, and you will find out all the details of, well, at least some of the details of why I have been off work and what's been happening. I've been off since April, so most of you will know that you saw us way back in March doing the dark side, and we haven't been on since. For that, we have missed you. Mr. Storm certainly has missed you. You've missed them, right?
Yeah.
Well, we're back and we're doing the episode 1. And I can honestly say it's good to be here. It's good to be able to even do this. I haven't been able to be awake at 9 o'clock for a long time. What do you think? I've not been up in the evenings for like 3 months or so at least. So we'll see how I fare tomorrow after a long day and then me being up late. But needless to say, it's been a long road to recovery. We're still on that journey. I still have lots of doctor's appointments, still lots of diagnostics to be run to figure out really what some of the underlying issues are. But I'm over the worst of it, and or at least I feel like I'm over the worst of it. Who knows? But I got some really great news, which I can share, which is that I'm free of burnout finally, and that whole discipline of mental health issues has now disappeared off, and I'm delighted with that, because I think after 3 years of it kicking my butt, I was really just happy to see the back of it. It's real talk. Really happy to see the back of it. So here we are doing the dark side. If you have any questions, pop them into the comment section. I hope that we can see them all. I haven't tested it yet, so I'm really hoping that this is all working very well. I know that it is live, at least I know that much, but I don't know if I can see your comments. So please do comment in the comment section. All right, so what is tonight's topic? That's really what it is, right? Let's get into it. Let's unpack. We have missed so much news in the few months that we've been off. It's been unbelievable. So it was really difficult to decide what our first episode back would be, and to that end, this week broke a news story to our relief that the officer that killed Sarah Everard has been found guilty, convicted, and is facing life imprisonment. But that issue is such a massive issue in the UK and around the world. I think it hits and resonates in different ways that we want to. Hey, Nicole. Yes, we see you. Oh, that's so nice. Very nice to see you. Oh, that's wonderful. It is working. That makes me feel better. So the Sarah Everard case we will be doing next week, because there's a lot to unpack in that story. You could talk about violence against women. We can talk about policing. We can talk about the disparity of different types of women. There's conversations that haven't been had, how it relates to race and gender. And so there's so much to unpack there that we wanted to take an episode to do that. So if you are really interested in these areas, we encourage you to sign up for next Sundays. It's going to be intense, and if you have questions, please do send them along during the week, and we would love to tackle some of those for next week. So next week we'll be looking at the case of Sarah Everard and Wayne Couzens, the person who did the deed and murdered this woman. The police officer that did that, I should say, because I think it's important to have context. But we'll be looking at that next week. So that's our next week topic. For this week, we are looking at toxicity of a particular identity. We're looking at the strong Black woman identity, because this summer was filled with strong Black women standing up and saying, enough's enough, really. We're not going to be puppets to you. And the reason this one touches close to home is because it's something that one could say has been labelled at me. It's something I struggle with, especially with my illness. I have struggled to admit that I need help, or take help from time to time, or allow people to know what's been happening or how bad it's got. And there are reasons for that. And we see that played out in the media. We see that played out with the cases of Naomi Osaka back in July, and with Simone Biles during the Olympics. These are two women who came out with two very different cases. Naomi Osaka came out and was really stressed about doing press conferences. If anyone's ever is a tennis fan, if you're a tennis fan, oh my goodness, if you're a tennis fan and you've watched how the press conferences are, they are vastly different from women than they are for men. And even in the men's world, it can be quite toxic, that environment. They can be quite accusatory. It's quite a bit of a, how do I say that? What's the words I'm looking for, Mr. Storm? Everyone just it's a meat show, right? They're all just kind of jumping in there. So if you are like Naomi Osaka and you're quite a private or quite an introverted person, it's your idea of a living hell. And she had been struggling with some mental health issues, and she said she did not want to do it. And the press and the French Open and everyone lost their mind, to the point that she ended up quitting the French Open and walking away. And that whole thing has spiraled from there to the Olympics and forward onwards, about whether she should be back. And I think it's really telling that her first return to a tennis match where she had to do a press conference, the first person who gets up to ask a question was so accusatory, was so like, oh, is this too much? Do you find it difficult? And was so in her face that she ended up crying. And I think there was nothing worse than seeing that toxic environment just taking it out on this woman, and it just really was horrible to watch. So there was that situation. And then we moved on to Simone Biles, arguably the world's greatest gymnast. I mean, she's simply amazing. Never seen anything in my lifetime like it. Definition of strong Black women in some ways, because of course she is strength, like in power, in her moves, in her athleticism, in the way that she executes everything, in the way that she challenges herself. And she ended up in the Olympics with a case of is it called the twisties? Is that what they call it? Called the twisties. Now, if you're not a gymnast, that will mean nothing to you. It sounds like something your kids will bring home from a lollipop or something. But if you're a gymnast, it's potentially life-threatening. It means that when you get into air and you are turning, you actually lose it's like your brain loses sense of where you are, and so the ability to control the turn and the land goes wrong. And it's potentially life-threatening, especially with the style of gymnastics that Simone does. And so she took a step back and she said she wouldn't be competing, and she let the other girls go on and do the team sport, and then she only did one event when she was down to do everything, of course. And the press came for her. The press, like everybody around the world, felt like they lost their minds, to the point that you had retired athletes who were gymnasts having to come out and explain over and over again, this is what the twisties is, this is why it's life-threatening, this is why she shouldn't be doing those moves with that, this is why it's a good thing that she stood up and said no, because there have been other athletes that have been pushed and they've been damaged for life. You know, there have been athletes who've been pushed beyond that point and they've injured themselves to the point they've never been able to move forward. And so those two situations really brought home, on top of years and years of kind of looking at the strong Black woman identity and how that impacts on Black women, but also how that impacts on wider society as well, that's really brought home the challenges that we have when we embrace our humanity and we allow ourselves to show a bit of vulnerability, a bit of humanity to the world, and the attack that's given in place. Mr. Storm, you've been quiet for most of this. Have I done a good introduction there?
I guess so. Did you say what you wanted to say?
You're not helping me, are you, at all? All right, so what are the labels? That's something that we need to look at, and what are the definitions of that? So I just want to talk about very quickly the difference between a strong woman identity, which can be labeled a lot of women generally, and the strong Black woman identity, which are two different things, and which sociologists and psychologists are actually looking at as a phenomenon all by itself. So the strong woman identity, often given to ambitious women, often looked at women who are trying to achieve, succeed, do very well, who can be in all walks of life, different types of fields, of course, but who exist a lot of times in a masculine dominated world, and you are the strong woman, you can do it all, blah blah blah. But it's used as a weapon to isolate, and so it's about ambition, but it's used as a way of isolating that woman, to dehumanize her, to often masculinize her. So when you hear that, you hear it often in conjunction with the idea that a strong woman has some sort of masculine trait and she's trying to be a man, and so you have all of this, and it pits this woman against other women, but also against men, and it's used as a tool and a weapon to isolate women who are ambitious, who are driven, who are trying to achieve something, be that from your pastor to the boardroom, to the executive. And oftentimes this label is given predominantly to, of course, white women, and it's done across the board. So it's really about, oh, you're that strong woman, you know, because you're ambitious, because you're trying to achieve something. Where the strong Black woman identity really comes from a different place. It comes from a place of survival. And what it means is that this woman, she can do everything while holding everybody, and while looking after everyone else, and while sacrificing herself. And so the strong Black woman is able to look after her community, she's able to pick everybody up, and she's able to fight and defend everybody, she's able to go out there and care for everyone, and she's often seen as somebody who will sacrifice her very life to do that for other people. It's about emotional restraint, it's about independence, but it's also about caretaking and how these women caretake, which is a slightly different identity. And it's really important to understand the identity that's being given, I think, because there's an intersectionality between race and gender. This isn't just about seeing the Osaka case or seeing the Simone Biles case as individual cases of women who happen to be of color and who happen to be strong and who happen to be falling foul of some kind of rule. There is an underlying, really disturbing current, if you ask me, of how we treat women of color, particularly Black women who are in the limelight, or who are leading, or who are doing well, and what we expect of them, and how we expect that Black women will often sacrifice their very life in the pursuit of not making anyone else feel uncomfortable, but in the pursuit of making sure they're carrying everybody else's burden, and carrying everyone else's cause. And so, this summer, last summer, in fact, we also saw this with the women who lead the Black Lives Matter movement, and their gender was weaponized against them. It was used as an argument for why we shouldn't support Black Lives Matter, is because women were leading it. It was almost like, how dare they get up, and they're obviously not in it for us men, which was so counterintuitive to what was actually being done and said, that it was shocking to hear. But it was like, sacrifice your life for us, but we're not going to defend you in any way when anyone comes for you, which was horrible. It's been really horrible. So I feel like I've talked enough. Jeremy, say, Mr. Storm, please say something.
Well, look, the reality is I'm not a woman, so I was leaving you to lead the conversation, and get your points across. I will say that the Simone Biles case stands out for me more than the Naomi Osaka one, or it's a much clearer example of the strong Black woman stereotype. Because what this narrative has is it has competing ideologies within it. Okay, so I am psychologically strong, but I cannot take steps to protect my mental well-being.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the competing narratives in it, and it stands out in the Simone Biles case because one of the things that we're not talking about is that she's a survivor of domestic abuse, and she is representing the organization that was culpable in her abuse. And she's been doing this for years.
Yeah.
After the Olympics, there was a hearing in the US Senate about the abuse. So she is competing at the same time whilst having to mentally prepare herself for these events, for having to relive the trauma. She's probably having people that are going through her testimony with her. All of these things are taking place. At the same time, she is trying to compete. And in that competition, now let's put the sexual abuse aside, she is carrying the expectations of a nation. Okay. Not only is she now carrying the expectations of a nation, she is carrying the expectations of the Black community.
Yep.
And in many ways, that is a heavier burden to bear than the expectations of the nation. Because if you fail, it puts Black people back years. Right?
Yeah.
So she has all of these things going on. And when she says, I need to step back for my own well-being, she is not permitted to.
Yeah.
Or there is no. I say I take that back. That's the wrong use of words. Because she doesn't need to seek permission to do it. There is the expectation of people that they can demand from her that which she does not wish to do. And in many ways, I think this speaks to the concept of ownership of women's bodies, but Black women's bodies in particular.
Yeah.
Right. And, look, there's a whole mess going on in the United States right now over my body, my choice. That's a whole nother conversation for another day.
Let's do that at another time. I think that's a different conversation. I think for the Simone Biles case, I think for me what was particularly painful was the fact, the amount of justification that had to go on her behalf. You know, it wasn't simply good enough to let her no be no and her say, I need to stop for my own protection, for my own health. I cannot go on, without it needing and requiring a international debate, not just a national debate, but an international debate almost on whether she had a right, whether she was even allowed to make that statement that for her own health and well-being she wanted to stop. And it triggered this international debate as to whether she was allowed to make that kind of a statement. Is she allowed to say that? You know, and listening to commentators around the world, listening to athletes around the world, most of the athletes particularly who defended her and were so grateful that she stood up, but at the same time, the real toxicity of hearing people say she should never have been picked, then she should have she's a quitter, she's this, calling her names, being really abusive because she's not performing as they want her to perform. And I think for any woman looking at that, but for Black women particularly, it hurts because you knew in your own life you have received the same. You don't have the grace to turn around and tell people, no, I'm not, and let your no be no and just walk away, because people demand that you should be halfway to dead if you're going to say, I can't come to work, or I cannot do this, my health is suffering. And I know that in my case, it is not the same. I really, it resonated with me because I know there were people who were really like judgmental that I had taken a break. And I'm nowhere near at Simone Biles' platform, but I'm at a public platform. And I know that people were like, you know, how dare she? She's obviously just faking it, or she's being ridiculous, or it's overblown. And people are making judgments, and watching Simone go through that in such a public way, it hurt. Like, it really hurt that people had such toxic ways of speaking about a woman's pain and were able to do that. And I just think, how dare you? And they questioned her strength, knowing the amount of strength it took to turn around and say, no, I'm not going to do something. Like, how you even question that somebody has, like, you know, questioning whether she even deserves a medal, whether she's allowed to be an American even. It was like, what is going on? You people have lost your mind.
But you see, that whole question of whether she's allowed to be an American or not, or a citizen of the United States, once again, it comes back to the issue of race.
Yeah.
Because she's Black, you're not really one of us. You're not really from here. But I think it's interesting that we are talking about this. And first of all, there's an issue of sexism to be talked about in this, in that a male sports person can turn around and say, I am injured, and that is accepted at face value. So a football player will be running, they will stop, and they'll be like, yeah, there's a pain in my hamstring, or a pain in my calf, whatever.
Walk off, no problem.
They walk off. That's accepted. The injury is accepted and normalized.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so we now have the question of a woman not being believed and taking at her word. But secondly, when she gave what the injury was, there was no acceptance of what she said until it was verified by white athletes.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
And even then, people questioned whether it happened to her or she was just using it as an excuse.
People questioned,
which I was horrified by.
What that harkens back, or what that reminds me of, is that during and for a long time after slavery, Black people were not permitted to testify in the courts of law. Their words were not, they didn't believe that Black people could be honest and truthful. So you have this being played out subconsciously within this conversation, you know. And you have to call out the sexism and the racism in this. And one of the biggest criticizers of Simone Biles in the UK, and Naomi Osaka, especially, is Piers Morgan. Now, we're talking about Piers Morgan, a man who is so mentally fragile that he ran off his own TV show because he was called out by the weatherman because Piers Morgan could not accept the fact that a woman had rejected him. And so he harassed her continuously.
Yeah.
Right? This person who exhibits such a fragile mental state to walk off of their own show is somehow given credibility to talk about the mental health and well-being of women of color. And his opinion is respected in this regard. And you have to ask yourself the question, why? Is it because he's a man and they're a woman? Is it because he's a man and they are women of color that he typically singles out?
Typically, he has a thing about singling out women of color.
Right.
In fact, in all of these stories, the central character of his rage has been a black woman.
So,
I think that speaks for itself, to be honest.
Look, I'm not saying Piers Morgan is a racist. I'm just going to sit here and drink my tea.
Well, I think there are a number of things that in terms of using them as case studies, not particularly dwelling on the women themselves, but using them in case studies. I think one of the interesting factors I found in the Naomi Osaka case, which particularly why I bring that case back into the conversation is because there is this colorism, there is this idea that we can pit different types of identity against each other, and Naomi falls into this category. You see, because for me, it's really interesting to watch the shift in the media's perspective on Naomi Osaka and how that love relationship has fallen. They've fallen out of love. When Naomi Osaka first came onto the scene and she first started playing in her Grand Slam tournaments, and she was both American and Japanese in her identity, the Americans were very conscious to constantly bring out her Japanese identity. First Japanese player to do, and then when and she herself would actively bring out her black identity, and she is very conscious about her black identity and very aware of who she is and who her parents are, and really is quite pro her identity on both sides, and really is. But when she got to the age where she had to make a choice and she picked to be Japanese and not American anymore, it was quite interesting to watch the entire American press turn. And it's been quite fascinating to watch the tables turn, because she went from being Japanese in America to being a Japanese person and basically being black. Like, they treat her as less than human. She has been treated as every other black superstar in sports. And I think that's a really interesting case, because this plays to an issue that we have in our own communities, but also that's being imposed on us and that we have to fight back against constantly, which is this idea that when you are passing, or when you are able to meet somebody else's expectations, and they can pull you away from the black community and they want to lift you up and pretend you're something else in order to claim you almost as their own, until you do something that pees them off, and then you become the I don't like the word, but you become the N-word to them. You immediately lose all shimmer and shine, and you become that person, that black person to the white person, because in the end, whiteness has this way of defining for itself who and who gets permission to be black or not, who and who has permission to be passing, who and who has permission to get closer to whiteness and who doesn't. And so when it feels like it's attacked, it almost turns. And for women particularly, you can be on the wrong end of that quite easily. I mean, it's quite it's really dangerous, because your life is on the line often. You know, it's, you've married into a family, you know, dare I say that, and you were okay because you were mixed, but as soon as you said Black Lives Matter, you became the black person and they want you out. Like, your life is on the line. So it's, I think the reason I find her story important to continue to bring out is because it touches so many points of intersectionality between color, race, gender, and also just personality. You know, she seems like a beautiful, warm person, but she is, by her definition, an introvert. And how do we allow introverts to be in the world, and do we allow introverts to be at the top of their field and at the best of their game, and then when it comes down to it, we expect them to perform? And the idea that she must perform, and this is really performative, because for her, she does her performance on the field. She doesn't need to go to a press conference. I mean, what's the press conference got to do with doing your job? Her job is to play tennis. So she plays the game, you know, and this is a difference with Simone, because Simone is, obviously, this was affecting her job, but this is, you know, Naomi was able to do her job. She plays the game, but because she wasn't performing, and it brings up those awful comments of when we hark back, and that women were put into zoos, and that they were watched as zoo animals and were looked at in that way, and that performative element of, you know, dance for us because we told you to, and we're gonna just, and that's what we're gonna beat you until you do it. And because she's not dancing, therefore they're gonna come for her. And I think that that's an important part, because it links backwards to why we are where we are today. Because I think it's not just out of a vacuum, like it doesn't come out of nowhere why black women are today treated in these ways. It comes back through our history and how black women have been treated for centuries. This isn't a new iteration, it's just happening on a very public platform in the news media. I mean, that's just it.
Right. So in the case of Naomi Osaka, you bring up another one of the competing narratives that come out of this, and that is to be equal yet be oppressed. And so what you have is, when she didn't have to choose her nationality, she was somewhat treated as equal, yet living with the knowledge that she is actually oppressed. And the oppression came out the moment that she made the choice to represent Japan. Yeah. Okay. And just to point out that these tensions that I'm talking about actually come from a paper written by Natalie Watson and Carla Hunter. And the third competing narrative that they identify is that it's to be feminine yet reject traditional feminine norms.
Okay, by Natalie Watson and who's the other
one? Carla D. Hunter.
Carla D. Hunter. For those of you who are following along, it's in the comment section, I hope. I'm not sure how that's getting on in Facebook, but Carly, it is certainly Carla. Sorry, Carla. My apologies, yeah. Carla.
So they identify these three competing narratives,
right.
And in both of these cases, we are dealing with the mental health issues of these black women. And in the United States, black women, they've done studies in this, that black women are less likely to be diagnosed with mental health issues such as depression.
Mm-hmm.
They're criminally underdiagnosed. there's also studies done that reveal the same thing of women in the UK. And so anytime you have 2 points, you can draw a line. And
Well,
so,
I think this is an interesting point to
I,
bring
I,
up, that we're talking about mental. All right, go on. Sorry, let me
no, so I
finish.
was just going to say that I think one of the things that we need to identify is that this lack of care, or that this narrative of the strong black woman is a narrative that goes throughout the diaspora,
Right,
right? And I think that's important to identify because you see common features
right,
exhibited throughout the diaspora.
yeah,
And I think it's important that um, Black women start to take their mental health seriously.
mm.
You need to start shedding some of these things. So, yeah, you were going to say something. I said, I'm not going to lead this conversation.
No, well, I wanted to interject here because I wanted to just bring up that we are talking about mental health issues, which are problematic issues to talk about across the board. So across the board, mental health issues notoriously come with stigma. They come with a lack of being taken seriously. People don't want to acknowledge that they're real. It's as if, oh, but pull yourselves up by the bootstraps. You can do it. It's just all in your head. Let's go. So there's that element of mental health issues that exists within the world. But there is something particular going on here, which is the issue that a black woman doesn't experience pain in the same way. There's that myth. So, of course, we're stronger and therefore we don't experience pain. And so we can go back to the case of Serena Williams back in 2018 when she was telling the hospital when she was having a baby, I'm having a problem, I'm having a problem, I'm having a problem. And her and her husband, no matter how rich you are, no matter how much money you are, had to fight for her life because she almost died because they didn't believe that she was having a problem. And the studies have been done time and time again about maternal health care, particularly, that black women are that die at the highest rates around the world in Western countries, because predominantly when they did the questionnaire, and I have to find this for you. So there was a study done where they asked medical professionals about the pain levels that black people exhibit, and I found, I mean, it's laughable, but it's horrifying that you are a doctor and you are a medical professional and you studied this, but you didn't know if you cut us, we all bleed. There are medical professionals who believe that we had thicker skin, that black women have thicker skin, that black
So
people
didn't
generally have
experience
thicker.
pain in the same way. Yeah.
They don't experience pain, that pain medication makes them addicted, so you can't give it to them. And all these weird tropes and ideas and stereotypes that they have, particularly that affect black women because we carry babies and we do those sorts of things. So therefore we're at the mercy of medical professionals quite a lot. That whole idea that a black woman is not experiencing what she's experiencing, it can be put down to, well, these women are talking about mental health issues which are difficult, but actually there is an underlying problem, full stop. If she had broken her leg, they would have still reacted the same way. And the reason for that is because there is an underlying idea that because they are black, therefore they don't break, they don't feel pain, their skin is thicker, it's more difficult to deal with them because they don't. And there have been studies done, there have been awful cases, awful history of the abuse that happens to black women specifically because of this problem. So we all
Well,
know where gynecology comes from, etc.
yeah. But I think you're absolutely right there in talking about gynecology, because you had Marion Sims, who's the father of gynecology, who is one of the biggest perpetrators of these myths. So he would operate on black women without anesthetic, and he'd say, well, it's because they don't feel pain in the same way. And that's where a lot of these myths come from. But there's a problem within science itself in that it is predicated on a lot of these myths. So, of course, we go back to, the taxonomy, the system of taxonomy with Linnaeus, and how he separates out the races by different, characteristics, which aren't bound, which aren't, found in any scientific, or don't find their source in any scientific studies or roots.
Mm-hmm.
They're simply his beliefs that were then expounded as facts. And for centuries, decades, people were believing this, and they were entering into their studies and carrying out the experiments with this mindset.
Mm.
But there's also the normalization or centering of whiteness within science, within a lot of these studies that are done.
Mm-hmm.
So the drug companies that are carrying out these studies are doing so with white people in mind.
Yeah.
And though they know that drugs can interact differently on different communities, the side effects and the study into the side effects on minority communities is not investigated as much, because there's a
Or world.
centering of whiteness within the studies, within the experiments.
And I think that's really sad, because we're talking about world majority people. So we might be a minority in a particular country, but we're a world majority. The majority of the people that live on the face of the earth are not white. The majority are of color. And so the billions, the majority of color. So what you're saying is that the only people that matter are this very small minority of people that live in Northern European and Western countries. That's it. That's all. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And
Well, look,
and it goes even deeper. In some ways, it goes deeper and deeper. I mean, it's just awful, because even thinking about childhood illnesses, a lot of the times they tell you, look for a rash like this, or look for this, and then they show you pictures of what you're looking for. And never once have I ever seen a picture of what that would look like on a person with colored skin that has color in it, that has that has melanin in, of any description. All the images that you are shown is, what do they look like on, what does this rash look like? Okay, it will look like this, and it's always given on a white person. And I remember an interview. Oh, I wish I had these. I have all this information, and I wish I had it to hand. But there was an interview done with a I think she was a health professional, and she was doing the training. She was doing the training to become a doctor, and she asked, well, what does that look like on a person of color? And nobody could answer her. And she said, well, don't you think someone should figure it out? Because we have people of color that exist. So don't you think someone should figure out? Because none of what you just said would apply to a person of color. So how will that look? You've just showed white pictures. It's going to look completely different. So you misdiagnose, misdiagnosis. So you miss them altogether. You bypass them because you don't notice. And then on top of all of that, they're not believed. And so you have all this layers when it comes to healthcare and black people, and then black women particularly, where it's abusive, because there are all of these myths that are not being undone and that not being recognized. And we see that across the world. In Europe, it's the same problem as it is in the USA, as it is in Australia. Those issues just travel with the people. There isn't a difference. And I think that that's really something to reckon with when we're talking about a health and well-being of black women.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just looking at the time.
Okay.
And there's one or two other points that I do want to bring up before.
I've just seen one that I wanted to bring out, which is the emotional restraint point.
Okay, so one of the points I wanted to touch on is actually related to that.
Is it really? So
yes.
I don't know what you wanted to say, but what I wanted to say was, what I find interesting about the strong black woman identity is that it's pitted against the angry black woman identity. So the strong black woman shows emotional restraint. So you will say something to her and she will not respond. You'll comment on her hair, you'll talk about her body, you might make a comment about whatever, she never responds. You'll overlook her, you'll make insulting remarks, and she's just very controlled. You know, she's strong, she doesn't take on board what you mean, you know, she's not bothered by your identity. The flip side of that, which isn't the same, is the angry Black woman identity, which is that you can't say nothing to her because she's going to tell you about yourself. And it is laughable that those two people are not the same person, because of course they are. You know, if you are being misdiagnosed, mistreated, abused, if you are taken to town like these women have been taken to town and abused over all kinds of forms, to say that you're not angry is unbelievably naive and ridiculous, because quite frankly, it would make anyone angry to be treated like that. And rightly so. There's nothing wrong with being angry, but it's seen as sinful almost, if I use that word coming from a pastor, to be angry. And that this idea that you are so calm and unyieldingly, you know, kind of just able to accept all of this bad treatment without uttering a word, and your strength is going to be better than theirs because you don't open your mouth and you don't go on the attack, and you have to be strong. And we see that displayed in actually some of these women just didn't come out swinging, and they didn't cuss, and they just bit their tongue and they moved on. And I think actually, to me, it's probably it's the frightening aspect of this identity, is this idea that you repress all of your emotional color, which is one of the primary factors in the study that's done by Sage Publications that leads to adverse mental health, adverse physical health problems, cardiovascular disease, higher rates of cardiovascular diseases, and all sorts of other problems, physical problems, because you are repressing constantly all of your emotional color to appear to be calm and strong and together, where really somebody else is being abusive towards you and you aren't allowed to call that out, and because for fear of being labeled the angry Black woman. And I think that that is something that we need to reckon with as people, and we need to stop playing into the hands of, and we need to say to people they are allowed to express and to feel and to have the full range of emotions. It's what you do with those emotions that count. So if you're abusive, of course that's not acceptable for anyone, but somebody else, you know, somebody doesn't have a right to be abusive towards me, and my only course of action, if I am to be seen as a good human, you know, is to say I'm a strong Black woman and I'm not going to respond to you and I'm just going to hold it all together. Meanwhile, inside I'm physically dying because I'm never able to process to tell you to stop abusing me. That's not right, man. That's just not right. So that's my 2 pennies.
So and one of the things that we've been talking about is the mental health of Black women, and how this strong Black woman stereotype has led to mental health abuses.
Yep.
And I think perhaps how we call things is important. And calling it strong brings up a physical connotation, which means it allows the mental to be neglected. Because in order to be a strong Black woman, you don't necessarily associate that with the mental stuff. Perhaps a more accurate word for this will be the resilient Black woman. Right? And I think that's perhaps something we need to start doing, is changing the language surrounding this conversation. Because, you know, you can be strong. And so when I said there were things that I wanted to touch on, the 2 points that I wanted to bring up is the emotional aspect, but also how these stereotypes turn women one-dimensional.
Right.
Okay, so you touched on it again when you said, well, why can't I be strong and angry? And the stereotype for the strong black woman, it was created by black women at a time that there was a need for it. So it comes after the period of slavery, and you had two stereotypes for black women, which were the mammy and the Jezebel.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Jezebel one, that's a whole different mess because once again, men are making women responsible for their issues, right? So that's
Right.
a story for another day. And then the mammy one, which is the nurturing one. And then there was a phrase coined by a black female suffragette. I think it was something like lift as we climb. So it was the concept of black women as they were going up the ladder, they would bring everyone with them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's really where you start to see the concept of the strong black woman come out. And that was necessary for that time period. I think that's something to bear in mind. The idea that, we can endure all of these things because there were no other options at that time. Okay, let's just be real about that. You didn't have a choice. But what it does now is it makes black women one dimensional. I mean, to be honest, the stereotypes of the mammy and the Jezebel after slavery made black women one dimensional because you were either nurturing or you were, this
Hypersexual.
sexy woman.
Yeah, this
Well,
kind of
yes, you
hypersexual.
become hypersexual because men, as I said, men are placing all the issues on women instead of
Yeah.
taking responsibility for themselves. But why couldn't you be nurturing and a sexy woman? Why can't
Mm-hmm.
you be nurturing, sexy, and a resilient black woman? Why can't
Mm-hmm.
you be sexy, nurturing, resilient, and angry? Right. So these stereotypes turn women into one-dimensional characters. So I think
Mm-hmm.
that's something that I wanted to bring out. And as I said, I honestly believe we need to start changing our language surrounding this.
Mm-hmm.
This is about black women's ability to be resilient and
Mm-hmm.
endure hardships.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The fact that you're resilient and enduring doesn't necessarily equate to being strong. I might be resilient because I have no other choice.
Well,
I
and it
might
doesn't mean that it
endure.
doesn't hurt.
No, it doesn't.
Like,
And I might,
it doesn't mean that you're not in pain. It doesn't mean that it costs you, your life. It doesn't mean that it's not costing you in a real term a lot of not only just your emotion but your physicality. I mean, these are women that often die at younger ages. Like I
yes,
said, the studies are done about cardiovascular disease, but also about high blood pressure, about strokes, about all sorts of things that black women suffer from silently. The kind
yeah,
of silent killers of our community. And I think you can be resilient, you can be strong, you can be tough, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't hurt. Like,
right. And that's the point. By changing the language around it, it
mm,
opens up the avenue to have that conversation about help and assistance. Because if
mm,
I'm resilient and I can endure, it's not seen as weakness to have help and assistance. But if I'm the strong black woman and then say I need help or I need assistance, well, then I'm no longer strong.
yeah.
I need
why why
something else.
why can't I thought you was tough? I thought you could do it all by
Right,
yourself. It's the idea of the independent woman, like you can do it for yourself, you do all of this, why do you need us, etc., etc.
right. And this leads me on to the emotional point that I was talking about or wanted to talk about, which is what is the effect it has on relationships?
Destructive.
If you are socialized from young that you must be strong, when are you taught to be vulnerable?
Oh, it's just destructive. It's really destructive. Can I just be real for just a second and say it's really destructive? It takes a lot of undoing. I think the problem is that um oh, thank you. It was good to see you. Bye, Han. We've got one of our listeners are off today. Um, I think that it's so this is one of the things that I guess women. It would be good to have some black women coming on here and have a conversation about this identity, because I think for me personally, growing up, And now you're talking about someone who's however many generations, a few generations removed from slavery, a few generations removed from, those kinds of eras.
I
Growing
think you
up
mean few in the very literal sense.
yeah, few, as in like three. I wasn't
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
literally three generations. Growing up with parents from the Caribbean, particularly from an island known as a Little Britain. So with all the weight that comes with the colonialization history, the kind of everything like that. And I remember growing up, and I won't give away my age too much, but at a point where the strong Black woman identity was everything to us, because we were, that is what you were raised with. That's how you were raised. You were going to be strong, you were going to be tough, you were going to do, you were going to go off, and you were going to be, and you don't need nobody, and you don't need a man. And if a man does you wrong, you're going to beat him with a frying pan. You're going to stand up for yourself, you're going to go out there. And to be honest, it's not healthy. Like, it's gotten me through by the skin of my teeth. Like, it's got me through some dark, horrible events of my life that I did not succumb to, because I had the identity to kind of pull from and say, I can get through this. But you're doing it by the skin of your teeth. You're not doing it because you're not doing it with others. You're not doing it in a healthy way. You're literally surviving those events and using them to fuel you on to go and do something else and to be stronger and better and tougher. And what's been nice is I've been alive long enough to see women over the last 2 years, particularly, and I will say it's literally 2 years, not longer, start to say that, and papers being written and research being done into this identity as a sociological phenomena that Black women have used to survive life, but that has come at a price and a cost, and somebody needs to talk about that. Somebody needs to say to us, hey, it's okay to let go of that identity, and it hurts to let go of that identity, because what else am I if I'm not strong? How did I survive what I've had
You're
to live
resilient.
through? Yeah, but this is it. This is what you're talking about, giving those words. I need other language, because I've had to survive this kind of abuse. I've had to survive that kind of abuse. I've had to survive, when you're talking about a lot of these women, when you talk about Simone Biles and her case particularly, and how horrendous her case is with the abuse that she's endured at the hands of coaches, the American team system over there, literal abuse, and she's having to go to Congress to speak on behalf of so many other athletes. She had to stand up and fight for her very life and being, and yet she has to perform for you guys because you don't believe that she's sick. I mean, who's going to be looking after her well-being and telling her it's okay to be resilient? Because resilient means you survived, but you need to go get help. You need to be surrounded by people who love you. You need to find a deeper, who's doing that? Who's having that conversation? And I think for me, that's a huge deal when we talk about the emotional toll it takes.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of things that we didn't talk about that I think I want to talk about just very quickly before we round off, because I've only literally got a couple of minutes. I don't know why I bothered to put an end time of 10 o'clock. We're never going to make it, but we'll try anyway. So there is something called maladaptive perfectionism. Basically, when they're looking at the coping tools, how do Black women survive this identity, or how do they use it as a coping strategy? What tools do we employ as women to actually remain healthy while dealing with this? So there's a couple of things that we use. We need to practice self-compassion. There needs to be compassion for self. That was something that came out of this paper in the journals by Sage Publications. I've got the link. If anyone's interested, you can contact me and I will send you the link. They talk about collective coping. This is something that we talk about, the sisterhood, and we talk about the importance of the sisterhood and how important it is we have this collective coping mechanism. Together we get through things. And I think for Black women, the Black sisterhood is you know, it's a bond that's stronger if you have ever. Yeah, I mean, I experience it myself. I have amazing friends who are my sisters. I can't speak highly enough of them and how they have helped me to develop, grow, learn. You know, they've held me when I couldn't, and I've been able to do the same in return. They also talk about spiritual coping, that Black women, the studies are done that show that we're some of the most religious out of all of the different categories of ethnicity or grouping, that Black women tend to be the most religious, and that is a way that we use to actually cope in actually dealing with the burdens that we bear in this case. And then it talks about some of the factors that happen as a result of this identity, like depression, like anxiety, like loneliness, like cardiovascular disease, and those sorts of things. And I think for me, it's important to note that there's a wide community of people who are probably discussing this, that we need to get together and have real informed discussions that help to move forward the way that we put together our own identities, but the way that we actually then socialize the next generation. Because, you know, I was socialized this way because my mum was socialized this way, and my mum was socialized this way because she was raised by somebody who was just one, you know, she was born at the time that there were these, slavery, etc., was still in place, you know. So it's surviving the hell that you've been given, and it's a cycle that goes on and on and on, where you're being prepared for the torture that is to come. But we have come to a point where we can name that torture now, and we can take that torture to court and deal with it in some ways, in different ways than we have been dealing with it before. And so I think that it's something that we need to really talk about, that we need to really form language around, as you say. It's something that is being studied, so we can keep up with those studies and ensure that our voice is being heard, because it's one thing for someone else to be studying us, but it's another thing for us to be able to actually contribute to those studies effectively. And I think that while we've talked about some of the drawbacks, there are some positives, of course. The determination to succeed, you know, that's something that comes from that identity. The idea of self-control, which is good for everyone. Self-control, if there was more self-control in the world of every other group, then maybe that's something that would be great. The work ethic that comes from that, you know, there's a strong work ethic there of actually being able to achieve and do. And I think that those things are positive things. But when they're all linked together, it can be really toxic, and it can lead to real damaging for the individual who takes that identity on board. So yeah, that's my little interjection of the things that we missed, or some of the things that I wanted to mention that I missed.
Okay.
All right, do we have a final thought?
Listen, as I said, I'm not leading this conversation. I am not a woman. I don't think it's my place to lead these conversations publicly. I think that's a space that should be taken up by women. You have your own voices, and I believe you should use them. So I think the final thought should go to you.
Okay. Well, I think for me, the final thought is really the resilient Black woman, and how changing the language that we use, thank you for those words, but changing the language that we use can be empowering. It can give us a source of help and a source of strength. And also it's an invitation to women to come into this space and have that conversation, because the next generation of women are relying on us to sort this out before we socialize them into an even worse mess than we had. And I think it's important to not feed that cycle, but to find ways to uplift one another. And then I think finally, one of the most positive things in reading all about the strong Black woman identity is to remember that the sisterhood is strong. Like, we are together, we can do so many things. We are resilient together. Together we can change the world, and we can make a difference. And that has happened in the last year in the world politics, in all sorts of places where we've stood together and we've held each other up and we've worked together to lift one another. And I think that that's something that we need to focus on, is how do we build and continue to build the sisterhood, and continue to lift one another up. So I think that's kind of my final thought. Oh, and of course, props to Naomi Osaka for standing up for herself, and to Simone Biles for standing up to themselves. Round of applause for just saying what had to be said and looking after themselves and doing what's in their best interest. Well done, ladies. We love you for it. He's silent. So that must mean it's goodbye from me and goodbye from him, who's really quiet and isn't going to say anything else now. And we will see you next Sunday, same time, same place, YouTube, Facebook, live. We are doing it this way from now on, thanks to these lovely people called StreamYard. We're delighted that to be back, but we're looking forward to next week's topic. It's going to be a heavy one, people, so just bear with us as we try and get through what is going to be a difficult topic on the intersection of gender violence, police brutality, and I'm pretty almost 100% sure that the issue of race will come into that conversation. Have a blessed week. Thank you for being with us, and we will see you next time. All the best. Bye-bye. Peace out. You can say goodbye if you want.